Hi, in this presentation we want to talk about the two-source hypothesis, which is a means for explaining the literary similarities and differences between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which collectively are called the Synoptic Gospels. So if we look at these three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we see that they have a similar portrayal of Jesus in comparison or contrast to the Gospel of John. They have a lot of the same sayings, stories, vocabulary, and so traditionally they've been grouped together, these three, underneath this umbrella of the term Synoptic Gospels. The word synoptic comes from the Greek. Syn means with, and we kind of know that word optic means eye, with one eye, is the idea that they see Jesus sort of with a similar vision. Now, what we notice if we compare Matthew, Mark, and Luke is there's some remarkable overlaps, and yet there's some distinctive parts of each gospel as well. And the question that arose within biblical scholarship is, how do we account for these remarkable similarities, some of which are word for word, as well as some unmistakable differences? Is that because of the oral tradition that this accounts for the similarities and differences, or is there some literary dependence between these three books? You can see here with the chart sort of the similarities and differences we're talking about. If you look at the pink color, that's what is in Mark as well as what's in Luke and Matthew. So the material those three Gospels share. So you can see that 76% of Mark is also in Matthew and Luke, and that for Matthew and Luke, about 40-45% of their material is from also in Mark. Then we notice, if you take a look at the blue section, there's some material that's shared between Luke and Matthew, in this case about 23 or 25%, that is not shared with Mark. It's not in Mark. And then we have some material that's unique to Luke. You can see that sort of aqua blue, 35%, over a third of Luke is not found in either Matthew or Mark. And on the other side there with Matthew, there's about 20%, about a fifth of his gospel, is not found in either Mark or Luke. And we can notice that Mark, though, there's very little that's in his gospel that's not in Matthew and Luke, only 3%. That's represented with the brown color. Then there's a couple pieces, if you take a look at the gray line between Mark and Luke, about 3% out of Mark and 1% in Luke is shared between Mark and Luke. Very little that's not shared also with Matthew. A little bit more generous, if you will, between Mark and Matthew. There's some material that we find in Mark and Matthew, but it's not in Luke. So how do we account for this? How do we make sense of these overlaps and yet distinctions between these three Gospels? Well, the leading theory is called the two-source hypothesis, and we get a sense of where this might come from if we take a look at Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. And let me look that up real quick. So in Luke, now Luke is writing, most scholars would say Luke is writing around 85, and this is what it says in Luke chapter 1. He opens his work in this manner. Luke says, "Since many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as those who were eyewitnesses from the beginning and ministers of the word have handed them down to us, I too have decided, after investigating everything accurately anew, to write it down in an orderly sequence for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may realize the certainty of the teachings you have received." All right, so a couple key things to notice in this opening line from Luke. First off, it recognizes that other people have written Gospels. Luke says that since many others have undertaken to compile a narrative of the events regarding Jesus. And he seems to have read them because he says he's investigated them. and he's used them in the writing of his own gospel. So Luke gives us a clue that, in fact, he himself knows his other writings and is using them in his writing. So might we assume there's some sort of literary overlap? Another interesting point about that opening passage is there reports that he's writing this to a fellow named Theophilus. Now, very likely, this is the person, his patron, who paid for him to do this investigation and write this gospel. If you watch the other video, we've talked a little bit about the nature of writing in the ancient world, how this was a specialized skill. And so therefore, even those who were literate would hire others to write for them. So for example, I'm a decent computer user, right? I can manage my way around using various software, the standard sort of Windows basket of software programs, but I could never write program. You know, if I wanted to create a program, I'd have to hire someone to actually write it. Well, that was kind of the case in the ancient world. People may be able to read, manage, you know, that skill of literacy, but writing took us not only just because of how one might construct a sentence, but even the handwriting. We have evidence that even Paul probably employed a scribe, probably dictated his letters, didn't write them with his own hand. All right, so moving on then, but getting to our question. So here's the dominant theory amongst biblical scholars. There are some other theories out there, but the dominant theory held by most biblical scholars for accounting for comparisons and differences between Matthew, Mark, and Luke is the two-source hypothesis. And the idea is there's a document called Q, which means Quelle, is short for the word Quelle, a German word that means source. And this was a list of sayings. So the idea is that Matthew has this Q source. He has Mark in front of him. And he gets this idea, you know, I really like Mark, but I'm going to add in this material from Q, and I have some special material, things that aren't in where that's written at oral sources, and I'm going to put that in my gospel. So that's how Matthew writes his gospel. And same thing with Luke. He has Mark in front of him. He gets the same idea that Matthew had independently, but he also has the Q source. This list of sayings is the theory behind Q that's been lost. And then he also has his own special material. Now I'll give you an example of this. Take a look here of a passage that's shared between the three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, their story of the baptism of Jesus. So let's read Mark. In those days Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And when he came up out of the water, immediately, uthos, in the other video, by the way, I talked about this word uthos immediately, he saw the heavens opened and the Spirit descending upon him like a dove. Actually, it was interesting, in the original Greek, the heavens split open. So there's a sort of dramatic sort of description of that Spirit coming through. Rendered, the heavens are almost torn apart. And a voice came from the heavens. This is the voice. You are my beloved Son. With you I am well pleased. Now there's an important question here. If I'm going to take Mark and use that as a source and supplement it with some other materials, the question is, who hears the voice? Who's this you? Who hears the you? It could be that John the Baptist heard this voice, or was it just Jesus, or how about other people? It's unclear in the text as it stands now. So this confronts both Matthew and Luke, and they take different approaches to this. Matthew, as you can see, he actually says, if we take a look at this last verse, of course we have this, he inserts this dialogue between John the Baptist and Jesus here in verse 14 and 15. And what's interesting about this is Jesus says, let it be done for now, for thus it is fitting for us to fulfill all righteousness. Major theme within Matthew, fulfilling righteousness. But here at the bottom, notice this, that verse 17, as Jesus comes out of the water, lo, a voice from heaven saying, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. So take a look at this word, this. If you think about it, if you were to meet me with one of my sons standing next to me, If I said, "This is my son," it would have to probably be in order to tell you, because you're standing next to me, that this is my son over here. All right? It would be weird if my son and I were standing alone and nobody's around us, and I turned to my son and said, "This is my beloved son." There might be some context I'd do that, but pretty unusual. The use of the "this" indicates that Matthew assumes that John the Baptist hears this voice. All right, contrast that to Luke. So Luke, first off, tells us that John is baptizing at the Jordan and that Jesus has gone down there. But he does this sort of weird thing, and not weird, but interesting thing in Luke, that he tells us right before he gets to these verses, this baptism story, that John the Baptist has been put in prison by Herod Antipas. So in some ways, even though this is a story about John the Baptist, he takes, narratively, John the Baptist off stage. All right, so that's interesting. But then, notice how this story develops. It says in verse 21, "Now when all the people were baptized, and when Jesus also had been baptized, and was praying." So this is interesting here, because in Luke's gospel, whenever anything significant happens, Jesus has just finished praying or is praying. The heavens was open. So one thing we noticed is Jesus is not in the water, right? Both in Matthew and Luke, you kind of have the sense that Jesus is still in the water, since when he comes out, this happens immediately, right? In both cases. Now here, Jesus and the other people who've been baptized have trudged out of that water and are drying off or whatever. Jesus has kind of removed himself, I think we can assume, to pray. And because usually when Jesus in Luke's gospel prays, and it's only reported he's praying, it's by himself, off to a distance. So then what happens? Verse 22, "And the Holy Spirit descended upon him in bodily form as a dove, and a voice came from heaven, 'You are my beloved Son, with you I am well pleased.'" So this seems to be a private revelation, if you will, to Jesus. Only Jesus hears this voice in Luke's gospel. So they both have to solve this issue, and they take different tacks, different approaches. And it's somewhat, the approach they take reflects their tendencies within their gospel. Matthew, there tends to be a focus upon Jesus fulfilling the word, and so therefore having John hear that confirms that the scripture is coming true and that righteousness is being fulfilled. While in Luke, he tends to focus upon important things happening right after Jesus goes off to be alone to pray. And so for Luke, his understanding is that this was a communication that only Jesus heard. And that so therefore, they're both kind of looking at Mark like his story, but trying to, for various reasons, whether because they don't think it's quite accurate or because more likely it doesn't fit their theology, what they're trying to say to their communities, they want to open that up a bit and not only insert the sayings from Q, but also possibly nuance the theology of Mark. Then they provide their own interpretations here. All right. So that's the two-source hypothesis. Hopefully you get a good sense of it, how it works together. The key is this, if I go back, here we go. The key is this chart here, where you can see that Mark, which is assumed was written around 68 CE, or maybe shortly after that, and it is mainly a document reporting the actions of Jesus. Matthew and Luke say, "I like that, Mark, but gee, I really like this list of sayings over here, and we've got to capture that. Somehow we have to make sure we don't lose those, the parables and all sorts of sayings of Jesus. So they both think independently of each other. I got a light bulb moment. Let's combine the two." All right. And then on top of that, they say, and we've got some other material, whether that be oral or written sources, here represented by the letters M and L, that they separately incorporate within their own text. So I hope that gives you a good sense of the two-source hypothesis, the dominant literary theory for explaining the similarities and differences between Matthew, Mark, and Luke.